Well, good afternoon. Hello and welcome to today's lunch hour lecture. Very pleased to welcome Dr. Ben Milligan from our Laws Department. Ben has a lot of international contacts, having done work for clients in the Caribbean and Africa and Australia, and having previous positions in the United States and University of South Africa, Cape Town, South Africa, and University of Cambridge. He now is in the National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security in our Laws Department. The UCL Centre for Law and Environment in UCL Laws. And he's going to talk to us today about his work under the title of Nature as an Economic Asset, a New Era for Environmental Law and Policy, ? Over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, John. At its core, my work really focuses on two things. One is, how do we manage the environment in a more sustainable way? And I'm a lawyer by background, so I take a particular approach to that problem, which is to look at how do we design laws, policies, governance frameworks, these macro level structures that shape how society functions to achieve the objective of environmental sustainability. But for the purposes of this lunchtime lecture, I thought I'd take a step back from the detail of my work and take an opportunity to focus in very broad brush terms on some of the different ways in which laws and policies around the world and in varying different historical and cultural contexts have addressed this challenge of how do we manage human interactions with the environment. So after providing that broad brush background, I'm then going to move on to talk about our rapidly emerging understanding of the role the environment plays as an economic asset, and some of the ways in which laws and policies and governance frameworks around the world are beginning to respond to this new understanding. And I think this has potentially transformative consequences for the way we address human interactions with the environment. And it's a transformation, the need for which is incredibly urgent. In many ways, we are rapidly undermining the environment's role as a foundation on which our well-being is based, and there is a critically urgent and very well internationally recognised need to fundamentally change the way we design laws, policies and governance frameworks related to the environment. So that's the future challenge. Before we get there, some historical context. As I mentioned, how in broad terms do laws and policies in the past, present and in the future, how do they address this question of how to manage human interactions with the environment? And the way I've characterized this is in terms of eras or paradigms, starting with an era or paradigm of no limits. And under this broad framework, this is essentially designing laws and policies that don't restrict the way humans interact with the environment. And it's been a prominent and arguably dominant feature of the way we've designed societies from the start of the industrial era onwards. And it obviously has quite dramatic consequences. This is an example of bison hunting in the American frontier during the 1800s. So in a paradigm where you don't impose limits on human interactions with the environment, human technological capability is capable in the modern age of rapidly altering the environment in a way that was never before possible. This has had consequences for our interactions with wildlife, as this is a powerful example of. Also dramatic consequences in terms of land use. This is a satellite image from Haiti. Haiti is on the left, illustrating how our interactions in terms of managing agricultural development, if not limited, can have dramatic changes, in this case, deforestation. Also dramatic consequences in terms of what we introduce through industrial and technological processes to the environment. There is a major problem today with the proliferation of plastic pollution. This is from a remote location in the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific, to give you an idea of how prevalent this problem is even in remote regions. So this, another emblematic example of an approach to environmental law and policy without limits. Also closer to shore, has dramatic consequences and has had dramatic consequences for watercourses, what we introduce into our land, and then the flow-on effects for human health. Now, all of these adverse consequences have prompted in different historical contexts a response, which is to establish limits. And particularly in parts of the Western world where there were early encounters with some of the dramatic consequences of not having limits in environmental laws and policies, we saw a movement towards attempting to restrict what people could do. And a great example of this is restrictions in relation to air pollution, limiting what industrial processes can emit into the atmosphere, emit into watercourses and other areas. Also very characteristic of this approach, this limiting or restricting approach to environmental law and policy, is the protected area. And I really like this image on screen because it simultaneously demonstrates the tremendous benefits of taking a restrictive approach to managing human interactions with the environment, and also the tremendous limitations of using that as a dominant approach of trying to manage our interaction with the environment. And this, the image on screen displays a mangrove, one of the largest mangrove forests in the world, which is protected by a designated heritage or wildlife protection area. And this as a governance tool does a wonderful job of enshrining areas of wilderness or natural environment from human interaction. But it does absolutely nothing to address the underlying drivers of adverse change to the environment. So in this case, it doesn't do anything to address the unsustainable patterns of land use that are spatially extrinsic to the protected area. And this kind of spatially explicit restrictive approach to designing environmental laws and policies also can be extremely problematic from a social perspective. Most people around the world are extremely reliant on the environment as a source of their livelihoods, as a source of their well-being. And if we set aside areas that are not able to be accessed, then that has very adverse consequences for people's livelihoods and well-being. And this, in many parts of the world, prompted movements from a predominantly restrictive approach to designing laws and policies concerning the environment to one of integrating conservation with development. And dominant in this approach is the idea that the environment and the way people interact with it is an interlinked social and ecological system, so that if we're going to design effective responses to sustainably managing the environment, we need to consider people as much as we do setting aside nature. And this is an image from a coastal fishing community in Ghana. I work a lot in relation to management of marine and coastal ecosystems, and a major challenge in that sphere has been the livelihood implications of establishing protected areas. Because if you establish areas where people can't fish, then many of these communities are very economically and culturally dependent on that livelihood. So you can't simply set aside areas for protection without considering the social dimension. And this has been enormously beneficial in terms of sensitively considering the social element alongside the environmental element, but it's problematic in that it still establishes the imperative to conserve the environment and the imperative to develop as being opposed to one another. And tools that seek to reconcile this under an integrated approach to designing laws and policies relating to the environment prominently emphasize planning. This idea that you identify areas where certain kinds of development can happen and can't happen, and this can be underpinned to varying extents by an awareness of the interactions between different components of the environment. A commonly used phrase is ecosystem based approaches to planning or management. And this is a very recent example of a spatial plan for an area of the United Kingdom's national waters. And what you're seeing here is an attempt to establish different areas, or at least identify different areas, where different human activities will have different consequences, and balance this tension between the need to develop, the need to exploit the environment, and also the need to conserve it. I think this approach to integration has a limited shelf life for the simple reason that it establishes conservation and development as in opposition to one another. And this opposition is at the heart of what at the moment is a dominant paradigm of designing laws and policies relating to the environment, which is the concept of sustainable development. And this has been regularly talked about, that the way sustainable development, at least at the international level in relevant international agreements, is conceptualized, has a tendency to embed within a legal and policy approach a lack of awareness of how the environment and how economic development are actually interrelated and mutually reinforcing of one another, rather than something that is always a question of trade-offs between one or the other. So these are some broad brush approaches to how you design laws and policies concerning the environment. We can have a no limits approach, encouraging development, a restrictive limit-oriented approach, and then an integrated approach where you try and balance an absence of limits with the presence of limits in certain spatial and temporal contexts. Where has this got us? In the history of environmental law and policy, where have these varying approaches actually got us in terms of how successfully we've managed the environment? And this is a nice quote from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was an enormous UN-driven scientific assessment of the state of our environment, how people were influenced and relied on the environment, and some of the changes in the environment over time. And I'll just read this out for everyone. So over the past 50 years, humans have changed ecosystems more rapidly and extensively than in any comparable period of time in human history. This has resulted in a substantial and largely irreversible loss in the diversity of life on Earth. Now, I've been a bit selective with this quote. It's very negative, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this enormously dramatic change in how we've managed the environment through the different applications of limits, no limits, and integrated approaches, it's also had positive consequences as well as negative ones. And this is very nicely captured by a recent report from a body called the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. And what this quote is really emphasizing is that our dramatic alteration of the environment has had enormous positive consequences for human well-being. And it's easy to forget that, I think, in discussions related to how the environment is managed. But our dramatic change in how we have interacted with and in many cases degraded the environment has produced significant benefits for the vast majority of the world's population. A key question though is, can we continue doing that? And this is the heart of the challenge associated with how we design laws and policies concerning the environment moving forward. And this is coming back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, who note that the gains that I talked about previously in terms of human well-being have been achieved at growing costs in the form of degradation of many ecosystem services, increased risks of non-linear changes, that's non-linear changes to the characteristics and interactions of different components of the environment, and the exacerbation of poverty for some groups of people. So these well-being benefits I mentioned earlier, it's important to realise they're not equally felt across different populations. They go on to note that these problems, unless addressed, will substantially diminish the benefits that future generations obtain from ecosystems. In other words, the way we have benefited previously from managing the environment is not likely to be sustainable moving forward into the future. So this is the challenge we really face today. And in many ways, 2015 is a crucial juncture in terms of designing, at least at the international level, our legal and policy framework for managing the environment. I'll mention a bit more about that in a second. But before I do so, I wanted to seize on this term of ecosystem services, because this was quite a powerful movement forward of ideas in terms of how we think about designing laws and policies related to the environment. And the concept of ecosystem services refers to the benefits we receive from ecosystems and the different kinds of ways in which ecosystems benefit us, the services we get from nature. And the way the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment broke down ecosystem services is in terms of provisioning services. These are the traditional way we think about benefiting from nature, the things we take out of it: timber, food, fuel, minerals, and so on. And then we move on to other categories. There is the important social dimension of cultural services. People identify culturally, spiritually, religiously with the environment, and it's important to keep that in mind when we think about how to design contextually appropriate laws and policies. And there are also regulating services and supporting services. The regulating services are the ones that maintain the conditions suitable for us to enjoy well-being on planet Earth. So these are things like climate regulation, water regulation, the way that ecosystems limit the proliferation of disease, or pollination services which enable and underpin all of our agricultural production. And then at the more geophysical, biochemical level, we have supporting services which are necessary for all of those regulating services that I previously mentioned to function. So this is a major step forward, I think, in our thinking about how humans interact with the environment, because it actually talks about that we're fundamentally dependent on service provision from nature. It's not something that we just trade off with our economic development. The next logical step is, if nature provides us with services, then, and those services underpin our economy, then the environment is an economic asset, and the components of the environment provide goods and services that are economically significant. And this concept of nature being an economic asset has been around for quite a long time, at least in academic discussion since the 1970s, for example. But it's really beginning now to gain traction in terms of high-level policy processes. And I'll talk in a moment about some concrete ways in which this concept is actually being implemented in legal and policy reform processes relating to the environment. But talking a bit more about natural capital. So if we imagine nature as an economic asset that yields a flow of goods and services that are valuable to us, then it has different components. And this is a conceptualization that summarizes a lot of different other conceptualizations of the different components of natural capital. But in simple terms, on one hand, we have geophysical capital, geophysical properties, contents, and cycles, and that produces for us flows of goods, fossil fuels, earth elements, minerals, salts, etc., and also abiotic services. For example, the oceans are a medium for transport. We rely on rain. And then on the other side, we have the more complex concept of ecosystem capital. In other words, the assets that consist of the functional interaction of different components of the environment, both biotic and abiotic. And these yield a range of benefits. We have biotic goods, so these are things like timber, soils, fisheries products, and then all of the ecosystem services that I mentioned previously in the context of describing the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So this is the concept of natural capital, and I'm going to talk for a little bit about some of the rapidly evolving research related to both the concept of ecosystem services and also the concept of natural capital. So I mentioned the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment on the top left. We've also had some major international coordinated research work trying to focus on quantifying the extent to which economies are dependent on the environment, and a great example of that, a very prominent example, is the so-called TEEB studies, focusing on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. If nature is an asset, it's also important to account and manage and measure it if we're going to implement that understanding in a policy process. And that's catalysed the development of standards. So at the international statistical standards level, we now have a common set of ways under the UN framework of statistical standards for actually calculating some of the economic benefits associated with nature and measuring changes in our environmental assets over time. And that's the system of environmental economic accounting developed under the auspices of the UN Statistical Commission. We also have efforts to change the way we measure economic growth in a way that relies less on measures such as GDP, which are very focused on how much you're producing, on flows of wealth, to actually focus more on the underlying assets that underpin those flows of wealth. And this is a very standard way of thinking about how you would run a business. It's not just about how much you're producing, it's also about how valuable your assets are that underpin that production. But at the political level and at the national governmental level, we very much emphasise purely production-oriented measures, GDP being a good example. And the risk of this is that you can have wonderful GDP or production-oriented numbers whilst undermining all of the assets that are actually crucial for your ability to continue producing that wealth. And there have been a lot of attempts to develop different measures, so moving beyond GDP, and a good example of that is the Inclusive Wealth Report, which you see in the bottom left with contributions, at least to the 2012 edition, from economists from UCL. Moving closer to home in a UK context, we've had the UK National Ecosystem Assessment, essentially trying to replicate what was done at the international level that I mentioned earlier in a UK context. And then moving on from that, we have a body now called the Natural Capital Committee, which advises the UK government on avenues through which we can better manage the components of the UK's environment that are economically valuable. So these are all quite recent research undertakings in the last 10 years. It's a rapidly moving space. And that rapidly moving and developing knowledge is really beginning to influence the way we design laws and policies around the world. And I pose as an open question whether we are moving from an era dominated by firstly no limits, then a movement to limits, then an integration of economic development and conservation, to an era where we actually internalize the role of nature within our concept of economic development. And I think we're at the very early stages of this, of moving towards an approach where rather than just focusing on how economic development proceeds without regard to the environment, we actually underpin the economic development discussion with an understanding of how the environment relates to that. And there are other parallel discussions emerging, for example, in relation to human capital, the economically significant contributions of how educated populations are, or how healthy populations are, being one example. So this natural capital discussion is a subset of a broader trend to move towards a more holistic asset-based view of wealth and well-being in our economies and societies. In the few minutes I have left, some concrete examples of how this new understanding is being reflected in laws and policies. The study on the left is something I coordinated at UCL in partnership with the Global Legislators Organisation, and we reviewed frameworks to establish natural capital accounting and embed that into environmental related decision making. And essentially this is a process that's similar to all the other kinds of economic accounting that governments do on a daily basis. It's trying to supplement this with three steps. One, to find out more about the status of our natural environment and how it changes over time. Then develop estimates about how that's contributing to economic wealth and well-being. And then obviously to process and communicate the results and take them into account in decision making. We reviewed progress in this context in 21 countries, and there is an enormous amount of innovation going on in terms of establishing legislative requirements to actually measure the way the environment contributes to the economy, and then establish management measures associated with those new measurements. Another innovation influenced by the concept of natural capital is the idea of economic incentives, including what are commonly referred to as payments for ecosystem services. In many ways, this is a logical progression. If the natural environment is an asset, then if people own components of the natural environment, it's probably fair that they should be paid for the ecosystem services that flow from components of the natural environment that they actually own. And this has been quite a prominent component of conservation strategies in middle and low-income countries around the world, where marginal agriculture has been a big driver of deforestation. So an idea that communities that previously their only source of livelihood had been cutting down forests, actually paying them for managing said forests, which are providing services that are globally relevant. We depend on them right here, for example, in relation to carbon sequestration. So this is the idea of payments for ecosystem services, a dramatic example of how this can change management of the environment. It can be seen in Costa Rica, which had rapid rates of deforestation, as illustrated on this graph, and driven primarily by unsustainable agricultural land use change. And a framework and accompanying laws was established in Costa Rica to pay farmers to preserve forests for set periods in exchange for the services those forests provided over short, medium, and long term. So it actually became a viable option to be a steward of a valuable ecosystem asset rather than just degrading that asset for short-term gain. And this was introduced in the early 90s and arguably has had a dramatic positive impact on the way forestry is managed in Costa Rica and also the forest cover in Costa Rica. There's been a complete change or arresting of the deforestation trend, underpinned by this idea that the environment is a valuable economic asset. What do you do with economic assets? You invest in them. You manage them properly. You ensure they continue to provide services into the future. Another natural capital influenced legal and policy innovation is the idea of impact offsetting. So if I proceed with an economic development of some kind that degrades natural capital, I should minimize the extent to which I degrade the environment as an asset, but if I can't do that, then I should build an environmental asset somewhere else. I should offset my impact on the ability of the environment to provide valuable goods and services. And there are lots of examples of this, including there's a very active discussion in the UK, for example. It is controversial potentially because it is an open question, I think, scientifically, the extent to which you can actually replace one degraded part of the environment with a restored part of the environment somewhere else. Ecosystems are not necessarily compartmentalized in that way, and this is very much an ongoing debate about the circumstances in which impact offsetting is appropriate and the circumstances where it's not. Another related idea, the concept of natural infrastructure. In other words, we invest in restoration and use of environmental solutions where previously we relied entirely on engineered or built solutions to economic development challenges. And a wonderful example of this is from the southern United States, and this is a natural rather than built flood protection barrier. And the way a lot of people think about this in commercial terms is that if you invest in an engineered solution for flood protection, it's often a depreciating asset from the day it's built. You have to invest in its maintenance and so on. If you use an ecosystem or natural capital oriented solution to these kinds of problems, it becomes an appreciating asset. The ecosystems associated with this natural infrastructure become more complex over time. It provides a whole array of values that a concrete wall to protect this community simply wouldn't. Recreational fishing, positive impact on property values, more resilient, it's self-repairing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a brief tour through some of the ways in which a natural capital approach to managing our environment is beginning to really influence the way laws and policies are designed around the world. And I think this is potentially very transformative, because what it does, it provides a way to reconcile an urgent imperative to conserve the environment with the urgent and very legitimate interest of billions of people globally to pursue poverty alleviation and economic development. And where previously these things were seen as an irreconcilable challenge, if we actually internalize nature into our economic decision making, it potentially provides a way forward to address the immediate and urgent challenge of sustainability. Looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Ben. So it's open to questions, and I see one of those two there, and then the other one afterwards.
Thank you. Hi. So I hope it doesn't come to this, but do you have any idea, looking forward, when, if there's a point at which where we would see a clear economic significant penalty directly from not acting on this issue? Do you think that you could put an estimate on that in terms of time?
I think the economic penalties in certain industries already exist, and not because they're imposed from a regulatory perspective, but because there are environmental risks that many economic development activities are starting to become keenly aware of. So I think that growing awareness of how lots of business and commercial activity is very dependent on nature is going to really drive a regulatory response in a bottom-up way rather than a top-down way of simply imposing it on people. A good example is the insurance industry, which can have major liability exposure in relation to sea level rise. Supermarkets. If supermarkets want to continue to sell fish to their customers, we're starting to see efforts to really think about, well, how do we ensure at the bottom of our supply chain that we continue to receive fish, which is a product of a natural asset? So I do think it's early days, but I do see and perceive a groundswell of movement, not just in the traditional impose this on the commercial sector way, but from within.
Thank you. And the one next to it, that's right.
Thank you. Tom Cohen, UCL Transport Institute. What bothers me is this feeling that if we bring things into the economic paradigm, we're naturally limited by what the economic paradigm can do, and what I perceive as an almost unavoidable narrowness. So, for example, we might find it easy to put certain monetary values on things that are important. Other things are much more difficult to value in a monetary way, and the obvious examples are cultural and aesthetics things. Isn't there a risk that if we carry on down this road, those will fall by the wayside, or at least we won't find a way of bringing them in?
Absolutely, there is a risk, and it's important, I think, in this it's important to emphasise that this way of thinking about the natural environment needs to be set alongside all of the non-economic ways that people relate to nature, and that it can be legitimate from a policy perspective to protect the environment, even if that particular component of the environment is not measurably economically significant. In relation to valuation methodologies, this is a major research challenge that a lot of activity is being devoted to. What was the last component of your question?
I don't know that I said anything in addition to that key point. But seeing as I've got the mic back, I will take advantage of the opportunity to ask a further question relating to the future, because my understanding of economics is poor, but it seems to me to be rooted in a view of the present and one or other approach to the future, which tends to bring us back to the present. So I'm just keen to understand how we handle the whole question of future generations, and whether we're trying to retain our environmental capital in perpetuity, or whether we can somehow fit an end point into all of this.
Well, this links to the question of how much can you substitute environmental capital for other kinds of capital. And there are ultimately there will be trade-offs involved in terms of there are some components of the environment that some environmental assets that you can degrade and substitute with other kinds of wealth, but there are thresholds, ecological thresholds. People often talk about it in terms of planetary boundaries. So I think a challenge in terms of endpoint is identifying what those thresholds actually are so that we don't exceed them. And the way that the environment provides benefits is often very non-linear. So you can degrade a system a lot up to a certain point, and then there is a sudden state change. So that's a challenge in a way that is not necessarily a traditional economic-oriented approach. The other response or a traditional linear economic approach. The other response I would make is I think the economic development paradigm is already dominant. This is a question of improving a very pragmatic solution in that it's, well, we have a dominant paradigm already and it's producing certain consequences. Let's work with that paradigm and improve it.
And a question here.
One thing that seems quite chilling about this whole thing is you talk about fish as being at the bottom of the supply chain as a natural asset, but on each, you don't seem to talk about the other species of the planet. You know, fish aren't just at the bottom of the supply chain. A salmon is a living being. You talk about restorative impact offsetting that, you know, if you damage environment, they can do it there. But what if there's been environmental of frogs and moles and stuff for generations? It's not going to help if you put trees over there when they're used to that. And if all people who are employed in this talk like that, it sort of to the animals, it must seem a sort of gobbledygook that they can't understand the words. That shouldn't there be in each of these a propensity for talking about animals as species and as much right to our planet as us? I'm not sort of a pro-animal person or anything, but I was very interested in everything you had to say, but I found that a bit chilling that you never once said, well, what about the red deer? What about the red squirrels or anything like that? And the other thing is, he asked 2 questions, I'll just, in case this is easier to answer. The wars in the Middle East and so on, they don't take any notice of this. And in Iraq, they just exploded areas which killed many species, and that must sort of, not knowing what the political international field is going to be, it must knock it back a bit, like Israel and Gaza and so on.
In response to that?
Conflict and impacts on the environment, yes, enormously detrimental, but also important to keep in mind that in many ways degradation of the environment is a large driver of conflict. And the US defense establishment has put out quite recently a lot of very detailed thinking on how the environment is actually, and climate change in particular, is a huge risk. So there's also that element too, rather than, so there is some degree of if we manage the environment better first, then that will remove the negative effects of conflict. I think, yes, it is cynical in many ways, and this kind of approach does marginalize, if it's overemphasized, lots of ways that people relate to nature from an anthropocentric point of view that's not economic, but also discussions about whether other living beings that live on planet Earth have a right to exist here regardless of whether it's our imperative or not. My response again would be that the way we marginalize all those discussions now is much greater than what would happen under this approach. And when I refer to things like fisheries, obviously the idea of ecosystem capital is that there are many interdependent abiotic and biotic components, and in many cases crucial elements of that capital are the things that are not charismatic species in any way, krill in an oceans context being an example. So it's not just a... Say again, sorry? Which the whales need. Yes, absolutely. So this is more, so it is a shift away from thinking about the environment purely in terms of charismatic species and scenic beauty towards thinking about it more functionally. And I think that approach does actually better appreciate these non-charismatic components of the environment, mold or bees, for example.
One of those two, that's the first one, in the grey shirt. Yes.
The entire globalization of business seems to be based clearly on Adam Smith capitalism. and this notion that they should be free to operate in the marketplace without any interference from government. The internalization then is a question of how are they going to be, are they naturally set up to be able to eventually internalize in the way that you're thinking? Are there things going on within the business structures and the way they're thinking, or are they still so short-term thinking that they're going to have a difficulty moving in that direction?
I think that varies enormously from sector to sector, and obviously there are large sectors of the economy that this approach is in no way beneficial for in the short term, and then that drives their decision making. So it's difficult to characterize, it's difficult to generalize, I think, but very globalized supply chain exposed businesses are some of the leaders in this field because they naturally have to take more of a risk management forward-looking approach. I think corporate vehicles are often very agile to respond to change in a way that public sector vehicles are not. And I do know, in relation to natural capital accounting, for example, I emphasize the public sector component of that. But there are already highly developed structures for accounting for assets that are not natural capital. It's not a huge step removed, and also there is much better resourcing in certain components of the private sector to actually affect that transition. So I think the combination of, in some sectors, more agile structures because they're not public policy oriented or governmental and better resourced is quite conducive to rapid change.
Thank you very much. I'm getting marching orders now. I do apologise. I'll have to interrupt at this stage. It just remains me to thank Ben very much indeed for showing how the management of this important national asset is taking form now, both here and globally. So thank you very much, Ben.
Thanks, everyone.